Okay, let's dive in. We're looking at a situation that's, well, it's pretty intense. Picture this. A massive company, Vodafone Idea, or Vi as we know them, India's third biggest telecom player, millions of customers, billions of rupees involved, and honestly, it feels like they're teetering right on the edge of a financial cliff.
It really does. It's a high-stakes drama that's been going on for a while, but something specific brought it back into the headlines just recently.
Right, that government comment.
Exactly. Just around June 10th, the Minister of State for Communications, Pemmasani Chandrasekhar, mentioned that the government is looking into uh, a potential mechanism to help Vi out.
A mechanism sounds potentially helpful, but also a bit vague, doesn't it? Given how serious Vi's situation looks on paper.
It is vague, and the situation is serious. So that's our mission today, right? To really unpack this. We need to understand just how deep this financial hole is for Vi.
And importantly, why should you, our listener, actually care? Even if you use Jio or Airtel.
Yes. What's the wider impact, and what could this government mechanism actually involve? What are the real options?
And ultimately, where is this all heading? It's complex, it's evolving, so we're aiming to give you that shortcut, that deep dive into what's really going on.
Okay, so let's start with the core issue, the debt. It's just staggering. V's total debt is sitting at 2.17 lakh crore.
2.17 lakh, just saying it sounds huge. And the real sticking point, the part causing the most trouble, seems to be these AGR dues, right? Adjusted gross revenue owed to the government.
That's the heart of it. AGR, it's basically the government's cut. The fee telecom companies pay for using the airwaves, the spectrum. And V's outstanding AGR bill is enormous, 83,400 crore.
Okay, 83,400 crore. But here's the twist, as I understand it. V isn't actually fighting the original amount they owed, the principal, which is about, what, 12,800 crore?
Roughly, yes. Their big plea, their desperate request, is for a waiver on the other stuff piled on top. That's interest, penalties for late payment, and even, believe it or not, interest on the penalties. That adds up to a massive 45,000 crore they want waived.
Wow, so it's like that analogy someone used, you forget a small parking fine, and suddenly you owe an astronomical amount because of penalties and interest on the penalties.
Kind of, yeah. It's a crushing amount, and they've been very blunt about it. They basically said, look, if we don't get relief on this, especially the penalty part, we might not make it past the next financial year, FY26. That ends March 2026.
They've even mentioned insolvency, going to the NCLT.
They've hinted at it, yes. The National Company Law Tribunal. It shows how serious they perceive the situation to be.
And their latest results don't paint a rosy picture either. A net loss of over 7,100 crore just in the last quarter of FY25. That's up from the previous quarter.
They did see a tiny bit of revenue growth, about 3.8% year-on-year, reaching around 11,000 crore. Apparently that's down to some tariff hikes and people upgrading plans.
But 3.8% growth when you're facing debts like this, it's like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teaspoon, isn't it? The analogy I heard was needing 300 runs in cricket and managing just one. Not really changing the game.
Not nearly enough, no. Which brings us back to that question. Why should someone listening, maybe a happy Jio or Airtel user, care about one company's money problems?
Yeah, it's easy to dismiss it, but you're saying the impact is wider.
Much wider. Think about it. If V's collapses, what happens to the Indian telecom market? It essentially becomes a duopoly. Just Reliance, Jio, and Party Airtel left as major national players. Remember when we had more choice?
Oh, yeah, definitely. It felt like there were lots more options back then. And fewer players. That generally means bad news for us consumers, right?
Almost always. Less competition usually translates to, well, higher prices eventually, fewer plan choices, maybe less pressure to really innovate or improve service quality, because where else are people going to go?
Those super cheap call rates we used to enjoy, this was peak competition time. A duopoly could easily reverse that trend.
Absolutely. But it goes beyond just your phone bill. Think about the ripple effects. V's employs around 10,000 people directly.
And then all the indirect jobs. The shops, the distributors.
Thousands more. Vendors, retailers, their livelihoods are tied to V too. Then there are the millions of actual V customers who rely on the network every day.
And the banks. Surely they're exposed.
Big time. Major banks, including SBI, have lent significant amounts to V. A default would send shockwaves through the financial system. And then, perhaps the biggest stakeholder? The government itself.
Right. You mentioned they own a huge chunk.
A massive 49% stake. Almost half the company.
How on earth did that happen?
Through converting debt, V owed them into shares. They took equity instead of cash for about 37,000 crore of spectrum dues and another 16,000 crore of interest dues.
So if V goes under, the government's investment just vanishes, goes poof.
Pretty much, money owed to the government, converted to shares, becomes worthless. So you see, it really is a national headache. It impacts jobs, customers, banks, and the government's own finances.
Okay, that explains the urgency behind Minister Chandrasekhar talking about finding a mechanism. The motivation to avoid a collapse is incredibly strong from their side, too.
Definitely. He said it's the government's duty to protect the ecosystem, to help companies like Vi flourish, not die. The billion-dollar question, though, is how? How do you rescue a company with this much debt, especially when a big chunk is legally mandated by the Supreme Court?
Right. So let's talk about this potential mechanism. What could the government actually do? What are the options being floated?
Well, one idea that's been around, though it seems problematic, is waiving some of those AGR dues, specifically the interest and penalty components. The Department of Telecom reportedly looked at maybe waiving 50% of interest and 100% of penalties.
That would have been huge for Vi, right? How much would that have saved them?
About 52,000 crore, potentially. A massive chunk.
So why didn't they do it? Seems like a fix.
It got complicated. Big concerns about it undermining that 2019 Supreme Court ruling on AGR.
Yeah.
And, potential backlash, scrutiny from the CAG, accusations of playing favorites with a private company, using what's technically public money owed.
Ah, the politics and the legal side. So a straight waiver seems unlikely.
Very difficult, I'd say. But maybe, just maybe, some smaller relief on that front could be part of a larger package. It's not completely off the table, perhaps.
Okay, what else could be in the toolkit?
Venue itself suggested stretching out the repayment for the principal amount they owe. Like way out. Over 20 years, with a 5-year holiday, a moratorium, before they even start paying.
So push the problem down the road, essentially.
Well, yes, but it addresses the immediate cash crunch. Remember that crushing 18,000 crore annual payment starting next year? That's double their current cash flow.
Right, the asking a street vendor to pay a mansion's mortgage problem.
Yeah.
Extending the timeline would make that annual burden survivable, at least.
Exactly. It buys them breathing room. Then there's the idea of the government taking more equity, converting more debt. They already hold 49%.
Hasn't the communications minister kind of ruled that out, though?
Jyotiradityya Hinzia did say recently that no further equity conversions are planned. But, things change. Desperate times might lead to revisiting that, though it seems less likely right now.
Could they change the rules for everyone? Broader policy reforms?
That's definitely a possibility. Things like reducing the annual license fees or the spectrum usage charges that all telcos pay. We saw the government step in with a relief package back in 2021, which included that 4-year pause on AGR and spectrum payments.
The one that's ending soon, in October 2025, adding to the pressure cooker.
Precisely. So another round of reforms could help V, and maybe the whole sector, without looking like a direct bailout.
And what about getting VU the money it needs to actually invest and compete? They've struggled to raise funds, right?
Hugely. Banks are understandably wary given the debt situation. Here, the government could potentially play a role maybe encouraging lenders, perhaps offering some kind of guarantee. We saw an SBI-led group offer a 14,000 crore credit line in 2024, but honestly, V probably needs much more than that.
So lots of potential levers, but none of them easy. The government's walking a real tightrope here.
Absolutely. Balancing the desire to keep competition alive versus the legal mandate from the Supreme Court on those AGR dues and the political risk of being seen to favor one company.
And that Supreme Court angle is crucial, isn't it? They seemed pretty final.
Very firm. Just last month, May 2025, the court threw out V's plea for a waiver, calling it misconceived, and basically saying all legal options for a waiver were finished. Game over on that front, essentially. That makes any government action that looks like reducing the amount owed extremely tricky.
It really does sound like a perfect storm for V. How do they sail into this? Let's rewind a bit.
It really goes back to that 2018 merger, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Vodafone India and Idea Cellular joined forces, hoping to create a giant that could actually take on Reliance Jio.
Jio, yeah. The disruptor. They came in with those incredibly low prices, free calls, cheap data. It shook everything up.
Totally. It sparked this brutal price war. Everyone, including the new Via, had to cut prices drastically just to hold on to customers. They started bleeding cash almost immediately. And then, bam, 2019, the Supreme Court AGR ruling hits.
That's the one that basically said telcos owed money on more than just their core telecom revenue.
Exactly. It widened the definition of adjusted gross revenue to include things like income from assets, interest income, etc. Suddenly, the amounts owed ballooned. The government figured telcos owed about 1.56 lakh crore collectively. V's initial share was pegged at over 58,000 crore. With interest, that's now the 3,400 crore figure we talked about.
And Jio, being newer, didn't have the same kind of historical baggage or non-telecom income.
Right. Their liability was much, much smaller. V, with the combined history of Vodafone and Idea, was just caught completely off guard by the sheer size of this unexpected debt bomb.
And ever since then, it's just been survival mode.
Pretty much describes it. They did manage to raise some money, about 25,000 crore in equity, mostly from their main backers, Vodafone Group and the Aditya Birla Group. But the feeling is those promoters are kind of tapped out now.
And the banks haven't been keen to lend more.
Very cautious, yeah. Stingy, as one source put it. Understandable, given the debt. And all the while, subscribers have been leaving, drifting towards Jio and Airtel. It's a vicious cycle.
You see it clearly in their network investment, especially 5G. While Jio and Airtel have rolled out pretty extensive 5G coverage, V was, as of April this year, only just starting in a couple of cities like Patna and Chandigarh.
They just haven't had the money to keep pace with the network upgrades. And those government debt-to-equity swaps we mentioned, turning debt into that 49% stake, they helped the balance sheet look a bit better on paper, but they didn't solve the fundamental issue.
Which is?
They're still losing money. Quarter after quarter, the cash burn continues.
Meanwhile, Jio and Airtel seem to be doing just fine, financially speaking.
Oh, they're in a different league right now.
Right.
Jio, with Reliance's backing, is investing heavily, expanding its 5G network rapidly. They seem to be swimming in cash.
And Airtel, holding their own.
Yes. Party Airtel is much more solid financially than VES. Better cash flow, a more stable customer base. It's worth noting, though, that Airtel also has substantial AGR dues around 44,000 crore, and they've also asked for relief on a big chunk of that. So the AGR issue affects everyone, but for V, it's existential.
This dominance by just two players. It feels like that double-edged sword you mentioned. Great for consumers initially with low prices, but dangerous long-term.
That's the risk. The fierce competition drove down prices, which was fantastic, but it also pushed companies like V to the brink if V disappears.
Jio and Airtel get the customer, sure, but they'd need to invest a lot to handle them.
They would. But the bigger worry is complacency. Without that third major player nipping at their heels, will the pressure stay on to keep prices low and keep improving service? History suggests probably not. That's potentially bad news for all of us down the line.
And let's not forget the human side again, beyond the market dynamics.
Absolutely crucial. You've got millions of V customers worried. You've got the 10,000 employees, engineers, call center staff, salespeople facing huge uncertainty about their jobs.
And the suppliers, the vendors.
Yeah, companies like Nokia, Ericsson, who rely on V's business. We actually saw Ericsson sell off a small stake they held in V just this month, June 2025. That's going to be seen as a sign of nervousness, right?
Definitely sends a signal. And back to the government with nearly half the company on its books. They're really stuck in this too.
They are completely tied to Vi's fate. If Vi collapses, that 49% stake, representing billions in converted dues, becomes worthless. It's a direct hit to the public finances.
Plus the political fallout,
Yeah.
angry customers, job losses, a key sector in turmoil.
Exactly. That's the powerful cocktail motivating this urgent search for a mechanism. They have to try and find a way forward.
So looking ahead now, given this whole tangled mess to Bollinger, the debt, the legal hurdles, the urgency is there actually a realistic path forward for V, a glimmer of hope.
Well, V is definitely trying to show signs of life. They are starting those 5G rollouts, however limited. They've announced partnerships, like with Samsung for network gear. And they have that plan to raise 20,000 crore in fresh capital.
But you said earlier, 20,000 crore sounds like a lot, but against Euro 2.17 lakh crore.
It's a drop in the bucket, relatively speaking. It might help fund some immediate network investments, which they desperately need, but it doesn't fundamentally change the crushing debt situation, especially the AGR part and that looming 18,000 crore annual payment starting next year.
So it all comes back to the government's mechanism, doesn't it? That's the potential game changer.
It really is. If the government could put together a package that provides significant relief, maybe on the payment schedule, maybe through facilitating major new funding, perhaps some policy tweaks, then yes, it could give VO a fighting chance. But the hurdles are immense.
The Supreme Court's ruling, the political optics of a bailout.
Exactly. Accusations of favoritism, potential resistance from taxpayers, if it looks like public money is being used to rescue a private firm. It's incredibly sensitive.
But letting Vinny fail also seems like not really an option, given the consequences we've discussed.
Right. The duopoly risk,
Yeah.
the job losses, the bank instability, the government's own financial hit. The fallout would be huge.
Hmm.
So doing nothing doesn't seem viable either, which points towards
A middle ground, some kind of compromise.
that seems the most probable outcome. The government will likely try to stitch together a solution, maybe a combination of extending payment deadlines significantly, perhaps some broader sector reforms that help VIN indirectly, and definitely leaning on banks, maybe with some government backing, to provide the capital V needs to invest and try to compete again.
But whatever shape it takes, it needs to happen soon.
Absolutely. Time is running out.
Right.
That FY26 payment cliff is looming large. VIN needs a clear, credible lifeline, and they need it fast.
You know, stepping back from the immediate crisis, the whole V saga feels like a massive wake-up call for India's telecom sector overall.
I think that's fair to say.
Hmm.
That 2019 AGR ruling really exposed how fragile the industry had become after years of those intense price wars and dealing with high regulatory costs like spectrum auctions.
And that relief package from 2021, the moratorium, it helped, but it feels like it just kicked the can down the road, didn't it? A Band-Aid on a gunshot wound, perhaps?
It bought time, definitely. But it didn't fix the underlying structural issues or the massive debt burden, especially from AGR. It highlights that maybe deeper, more sustainable reforms are needed for the sector's long-term health.
What kind of reforms are talked about?
Things like looking at spectrum pricing. India's spectrum costs are often cited as being very high globally, and simplifying some of the complex tax structures the industry faces, making it a healthier environment for investment overall.
And for us, the users, the message seems pretty clear: value competition.
Absolutely. Don't take it for granted. Those incredibly low data prices, the fast network rollouts we've benefited from, that came directly from fierce rivalry.
If Vi disappears and we're left with just two big players,
Yeah, those amazing Euro 100 unlimited plans might just become a nostalgic memory.
it's a real possibility.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. Vodafone Idea's future is, well, it's hanging in the balance.
Yeah.
That seems undeniable. The government is signaling they want to help, they're working on this mechanism, but the path is fraught with challenges and the clock is ticking very, very loudly.
And the stakes are incredibly high. This isn't just about one company's finances. It affects competition in a vital sector, thousands of jobs, millions of customers, the stability of banks, and the government's own bottom line. The drama is definitely far from over.
So it's one to keep a close eye on. It really highlights how these huge industries work, or sometimes struggle to work. Whether you're a VI customer, use another network, or just watching India's economy, this story matters.
And maybe a final thought to leave with you. This whole situation forces us to ask some big questions, doesn't it? About the government's role. How do you balance enforcing legal dues, promoting competition which benefits everyone, and dealing with the harsh economic realities that can threaten a critical industry? Will VIN manage some kind of dramatic turnaround? Or is this a slow fade? And what does either outcome really mean for India's digital future? Something to ponder.